Hi y'all, it's Nicole. Welcome back to my channel. It is a rather dreary, rainy day here today, and I want to talk to you about the use of alcohol in our military history. Now, this is kind of a weird topic for me if you know me for a couple of reasons. First, I don't really drink, and second, I usually don't touch anything relating to military history with a 10-foot pole, just because I have a hard time getting interested in battles unless it's something really unusual like the cowpens. I just don't really care. To each their own. We all have our own thing, right? But last semester when I was doing all the required reading, I came across just this one sentence in Robert Middlecoff's The Glorious Cause that, well, it made me curious. And I had to make a little note in my notebook to look into this more later when I had some time. And that relates to the use of rum rations during the American Revolution for military strategic reasons. And Middlecoff refers to it as something that was thought to dull fears and summon courage. And I guess for me, not having studied this before, I knew that throughout history there's been issues with water quality and safety, so for a huge chunk of the time, beer and wine and liquor have just been safer to consume, right? So when I've seen mentions of liquor rations, especially relating to like the Quartering Act, which I did a video on, I've always thought about it just in those terms of keeping the men from getting sick from water and, maybe just kind of keeping them overall in a little bit better of a mood, I suppose. Which, that second part is closer to the truth. It is about morale, but it's not about morale just, 24/7. It's specifically about getting them to do what you need them to do in battles and on marches. And we know that because when those two things came up, apparently it was really common that commanders on both sides, British and Continental armies, would give extra rations. And that's what we're going to get into is kind of the how and the why of them doing that. So when I tried to do the research on this topic, because like I said, I was curious, there really isn't that much that has been published that I could even find. I mean, maybe it's somewhere, but it was some weird search term that I couldn't figure out. I don't know. I did find two books that kind of touched briefly on the 18th century. They were Shooting Up, A History of Drugs and Warfare, and Killer High, A History of War and Sex Drugs. So both of these books are not talking specifically about that period. They're talking about kind of throughout military history. And when it comes to those things, those books and other sources seem to focus either on 19th and 20th centuries, especially when we get into amphetamines and stuff like that available, or farther back when we're talking about what substances might the Viking berserkers have used in battle, or what about the functions of the coca leaf in South America. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there, but this is, the 18th century colonial America is just something that they skip right over. And I went through my own shelf of books that I thought, oh, there might be something in here. No. Nope. There was that one line in The Glorious Cause that just got me curious, and then that was pretty much it. What I did find in those two books, though, that is 18th century at least, is a history of the drink grog, which came about in 1740 when British Admiral Edward Vernon, whose nickname, I believe, was Old Grog. I have to double check that when I'm editing. But he was trying to deal with the issue they were having in the Navy of their sailors wanting to consume their entire liquor ration pretty quickly after receiving it each day. So, they go through periods of being kind of drunken to later being just way more sober than anyone really wanted them to be. And before we continue, I want to briefly discuss the quantity of that ration, because when I'm reading this, I don't know about you, but I need to know what that ration even really equates to, at least roughly, right? So we know what we're talking. And the typical ration was half a pint of rum, or the equivalent in, whatever other alcohol they could get their hands on. So an imperial pint, which different from US, half an imperial pint is roughly equal to 9.6 US fluid ounces. So for us Americans, this is essentially the equivalent of a little over 6 shots worth of liquor. So if you've gone to the bar, you've gone out with your buddies doing shots, that's what we're talking, roughly 6 of those every day as part of their ration. Not exact, but that just gives us a little bit of context while we discuss this moving forward. And, I'm talking about, this is an ongoing issue, right? Dealing with it throughout, and the issue results in men often getting drunken, acting stupid, and then their commanders have to deal with that nonsense, right? So they have to deal with, maybe court-martial because it just got out of hand. Maybe now there's soured relations with townspeople because troops acted stupid when they weren't on duty. All sorts of stuff going on. And it's those things we can look at and be like, oh, maybe it's just a couple bad apples. It's not pervasive of the entire army. But let's talk about Washington crossing the Delaware. And I'm going to have to put that painting up there because that is what I think of when I think of him crossing the Delaware in the middle of winter for a surprise attack on the Hessians in Trenton, right? Kind of this momentous thing in our revolution from the American perspective, because this is a time when Washington's still trying to get his troops in shape. He's still trying to kind of get in the groove, figure out his method to find a way for us to win. And this was something that gave everyone hope when we were able to accomplish something like this. Less commonly discussed is that the fact after the battle, Washington ordered his men to destroy the Hessian supply of rum, which had been there for their rations. And rather than obeying their commanding officer, the men decided to consume it instead. And apparently, they got drunk. So now, where I have this in my mind for crossing over there, on the return trip, we probably had a bunch of men not walking straight, tripping into the boats, trying to paddle across the water in the midst of winter. It was probably a mess, and Washington was probably shaking his head, to say the least. But drunken antics aside, both sides still felt liquor rations were just vital for military success. And that's really what I want to talk about today, even though I'm trying to show both sides of the equation. It's not just about this is something they're used to consuming, or we're trying to give them a safe alternative to polluted water. It was common, we just had an important victory. Here's some liquor to celebrate. There's something major going on, like the Declaration of Independence. Here's something to celebrate. We're trying to get everyone in that same mood. But also, we're about to have to go on a long march, right? So we need y'all to be able to persevere, be in a good mood, get it done, even though it's miserable. Here's an extra ration. We're about to go into battle. It's terrifying. You're going to have to stand, in a field, lined up against the enemy who's also lined up, facing death head on, basically. I know you want to run. Here's some liquor to make it better. Not that the officers were going to term it quite like that for the men, but that's the reality of what it was. They were trying to make the men just drunk enough to do something that otherwise, their logical, rational brain would be like, oh God, this is a bad idea. Why are we standing here? We're going to die. So this is something that we see common in our history. It's something that's discussed. And it's something that, like I said, I had not thought about, because I think now we want to think of these men as they're fighting for a purpose. They're out there on the field because they want independence, because they're fighting against tyranny or whatever else. And we have it in our head that this is what's holding them, keeping them there, so that they can stand firm and they can fight against the enemy. But even so, soldiers are human. Soldiers were terrified. And alcohol was a tool that their commanders used to get them to stand there and stand there in the face of their potential deaths. So, anyway, sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. It does kind of give me the idea of just like, the meme with a bunch of guys standing around drinking beer and being like, oh, you know what? I'm just drunk enough that sounds like a good idea. Here, hold my beer. And I do kind of have that in my mind now when I think of them on the battlefield. And I guess on the battlefield, if it messes up your marksmanship, it doesn't matter because everyone's all clustered, and even if you're seeing double, you'll probably hit someone, right? It's one of those things. It is humorous, but I just kind of laugh because it's better to laugh than just be depressed by the topic. And it's a very heavy thing to think about. I mean, in the modern day, we talk about consent being really important in all different aspects of life. And back then, you're getting men drunk so that they'll stand there and risk their lives. If the men chose to go out and get drunk of their own volition, no big deal. But for me, sitting here thinking about their commanding officers getting them drunk so that they're willing to go die. Oh, that just hits me hard. I don't know about y'all. But to move on from my emotions there and from the little bit I found in modern histories, let's tackle what some primary sources said. I found a little bit there. And the first thing, on August 16th of 1777, George Washington writes to John Hancock, and he says that, in like manner, since our imports of spirits have become so precarious, nay, impracticable on account of the enemy's fleet, which infests our whole coast, I would beg leave to suggest the propriety of erecting public distilleries in different states. The benefits arising from the moderate use of strong liquor have been experienced in all armies, and are not to be disputed. So that's a big deal. Washington is really advocating for the use of liquor rations to the point that he's wanting them to start distilleries so that their inventory doesn't get interrupted there. So that's clearly he supported it, right? And it's widely accepted on the battlefield, but there's also situations where the armies on both sides, they're out. They don't have anything. They have to find a way for their men to fight anyway. I mean, this is the reason that he's talking about the distilleries, because they know that it's a risk that they might run out of this and have to figure out something else, right? And there's cases where men didn't have any liquor, they went into battle, they still performed well. They were fully capable of it, right? There's also instances where it went bad. And there's at least one where I seriously wonder about the number of brain cells their commanding officers possessed. Because before the Battle of Camden in South Carolina in 1780, the Continental Army was dealing with this exact problem: lack of liquor to give them in for rations. And this issue is detailed in the writing of Colonel Ortho Holland Williams, who says, as there were no spirits yet arrived in camp, and as until lately it was unusual for troops to make a forced march or prepare to meet an enemy without some extraordinary allowance, it was unluckily conceived that molasses would, for once, be an acceptable substitute. The troops of General Gates's army had frequently felt the bad consequences of eating bad provision, but at this time, a hasty meal of quick-baked bread and fresh beef, with a dessert of molasses mixed with mush or dumplings, operated so cathartically as to disorder very many of the men who were breaking the ranks all night, and were certainly much debilitated before the actions commenced in the morning. Let's talk about that for a second. So, yes, we know the issue of bad provisions, meaning food that, had started to go bad, it's not really good to eat. We know this was a problem for armies throughout history, right? It rather frequently caused digestive problems. But in this case, Williams is talking about an issue that they brought on themselves. Because they're out of liquor, they're trying to figure out what else can we do for morale right before we're about to go into battle, when we really, really need to boost morale. And they thought, oh, we don't have alcohol, but maybe sugar will help. So rum's derived from molasses. Molasses isn't going to get them drunk, but hey, it's sweet. We have some of it. Let's give them some of that for dessert. That'll make things better, right? If their wives or mothers had been with them, and I'm sure some of them were, but maybe they weren't in on the planning, I don't know. I'm wondering why no one spoke up and said, this is a bad idea. Because a common home remedy for constipation is a tablespoon or two of molasses. And they are giving these men way more than that. So, whereas normally, issues with their digestion are caused by bad provisions, now they're bringing it on themselves and they're giving their men diarrhea from their own stupidity. So, they operated so cathartically, it disordered the men, they're breaking ranks all night. Basically, the next day, they're going into battle sick. And if the name of the Battle of Camden rings a bell for you, and you're like, hey, I've heard of that before, there's a reason. Because it was a humiliating defeat for the Continental Army. They ran all different directions. General Gates included. He runs all the way to Hillsborough, North Carolina, before he stops, tries to regroup, explains his actions to Congress, who relieve him of command of the southern portion of the Continental Army because of all of this. And I've seen that, historians have talked about military tactics as a reason for the defeat. Maybe Gates expected the British to do one thing, they did something else. Maybe it's the nature of militia where they just weren't dependable to stand there and face down death. But let's not overlook the fact that Gates and his officers made their men sick on the eve of battle. That just struck me. Then a couple years later, something else I was able to find in 1782 on May 16th, in the general orders issued under the authority of Washington, it says, the vile practice of swallowing the whole ration of liquor at a single draught is also to be prevented by causing the sergeants to see it duly distributed daily and mixed with water at stated times, in which case, instead of being pernicious, it will become very refreshing and salutary. So, in 1782, they are still dealing with something that we know was an issue back in 1740, where men are given liquor and they want to drink it all at once. I don't understand. Apparently, this was an issue to the extent that they actually had to have lists. And if a man, had issue with alcoholism or whatever they deemed the biggest issue relating to it, they would strike the man from the list and he would no longer be able to get liquor rations. He would be given something else in lieu of that. My question is, how do you identify an alcoholic when you are intentionally given the entire army at least 6 shots worth of liquor every day? I mean, sometimes our modern understanding of things it does not compute. But either way, I thought this was really interesting, especially to consider the impact of this, with the Battle of Camden, or even the aftermath of Trenton. This is weird, and this is not something that I've thought about or heard about in reference to those battles in the past. So I hope you found that interesting. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you're interested in reading more on the use of substances in military history, those couple of books I mentioned, they're down below in the description box in my bibliography as always. Make sure you hit the like button to help me out with the algorithms, and if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so that you do see more videos that I put out. Thanks so much. I will see y'all next time.